We have a really packed agenda and an amazing set of speakers, and we really want a time to have as much of a robust discussion as we can. So I want to thank everybody for joining. My name is Dina Arguello. I'm the Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. And before I get too far, we really want to thank Rahel Kamal from PSR staff and Colin Miller with EJ Solutions, who we put this together really quickly. And so I just, again, just tons of gratitude for helping us to put all of this together. You know, PSR-LA and many of our allies who are on this phone, on this call, have a long history of working on AB 32 and engaging around climate policy. And giving us real solutions. Okay, I hope I'm back. PSR-LA and myself, I have been part of the last 3 scoping plans. Was there when AB 32 was being negotiated, and you know, I often joke that I'm petty, and we told them that this program would not achieve some of the justice goals that are embedded in AB 32, and this year, it's incredibly exciting to be part of the scoping plan in a moment where the environmental justice community has made so many gains in California, is growing, and now we have a broad coalition of folks who actually can engage in the scoping plan process, because we know that it's always a battle to win the things that are important to our communities. And so what's different this year is this the organizing that we are doing and showing up and pushing on CARB. But I think the other part is that as a movement, we have gotten bolder about fighting for real solutions. And part of today's workshop is really about us being able to understand what is carbon capture and sequestration, what are the benefits and the burdens, and who bears those benefits, who reaps the benefits, who bears the burdens, and what are the solutions that actually could work for our communities that involve capturing carbon, because we all know it would be great to capture it. How it's done, where it's done, makes a difference. And so I'm going to introduce the speakers, because I don't want to jinx the fact that I can, that you can actually hear me. So this is a really amazing lineup. Roger Lynn is a climate and air counsel for the California Environmental Justice Alliance. He's worked as a lawyer for Communities for a Better Environment, a senior attorney for the Center for Raised Poverty Environment. He's a joy to work with. And I'm gonna be brief about folks' bios so we can get to the meat of the presentation. And next is Carolyn Rafsensperger with, she is Executive Director of the Science and Environmental Health Network, a longtime mentor and one of the principal architects of the Precautionary Principle, and just, you know, an amazing intellect, and it is an honor to be working with her again on some of the stuff. Then there's Brent Bucknum, who will be talking about the carbon cycle and current solutions and implementations for frontline communities. He's the founder of Hyphae Design Laboratory. And then our last speaker is Anthony Carifa Rogers-Wright, and he will be talking about, and he's with the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, and we'll be talking about false solutions and the myth of technical solutions to solve these problems. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to Roger. And I know that I didn't say all of the things you've done, but if you want to share some of those, please do.
Oh no, thank you, Martha. That was a great intro. I can retire happily now. I really appreciate being invited to speak on this panel, and this is a serious issue that we really need to figure out quickly, because my presentation is basically going to dive into the current and anticipated regulatory landscape in California, and all signs point to the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, wanting to use this false solution of engineered carbon capture and sequestration quite heavily in their blueprint for their climate policy for the next 23 years. And on that note, just really quickly, so that we're on the same page, what is the scoping plan? It's literally a blueprint of how California meets its climate and equity policies. It happens every 5 years. The next one has to be done in 2022. So we're in a more than year-long process that's already begun. I expect the 2022 scoping plan to be approved around November, December, most likely December of 2022. So like Martha was saying, this is a great timing. We have a head start, sort of a head start, to just get all of our ducks in a row. What's interesting about this plan, though, is that typically the plans are linked to our greenhouse gas reduction targets. The first one up here, SB 32, we have to get to 40% below GHG emissions, 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Oh, not far away. What's different about this plan, though, is because of an executive order from the prior administration, and also continuing with the current administration, we're looking all the way out to 2045. So this is a very, very long trajectory, longer than the prior scoping plans have looked at. But again, the scoping plan is a blueprint of how we get to these goals. Next slide, please. This chart shows the greenhouse gas emissions by sector and pinpoints 3 goals. The first, 1990 levels by 2020, that was AB 32 in California. We met that one. The next one, though, the 2030 goal, 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, you can see there is a steeper slope. That means we need to go faster and bigger with our greenhouse gas emission cuts. Next slide, please. And this is an absolute approximation, but if we just continue the trajectory down to go from 1990 to, for 2020 to 2030, it looks like we go straight through the 40% below 1990 levels 2030 goal to get to 0 by 2045. But the important part to remember, it is net zero. The neutrality executive order is interpreting neutrality as where sources of carbon equal sinks of carbon. Next slide, please. So looking at this triangle, this is the massive amount of greenhouse gases by 2045. The area encompassed in this triangle is the total amount of greenhouse gases that the Air Resources Board expects to net out. Of course, this looks at, for us, worst case scenario, assuming emissions just stay consistent and just going straight down to the net by 2045, and how CARB, the Air Resources Board, has proposed to meet this neutrality goal, again, where sources equal sinks, is through these 4 methods. Offsets, which the environmental justice community and many of those watching are well aware of. Second, carbon removal. Third, carbon capture and sequestration. And then 4th, nature-based solutions. I'll get back to the governor's announcements to accelerate our neutrality goal in a second. But just from this slide, I wanted to represent the giant chunk of carbon removal that CARB is potentially proposing with this upcoming scoping plan. Next slide, please. And how the scoping plan works is it will create certain scenarios. And the Air Resources Board will then vote on a certain scenario to have it approved to be that is the blueprint. That is the scenario for the scoping plan that is going to get us to our 2045 and hopefully 2030 as well goals. This screenshot is from the Achieving Carbon Neutrality in California report that was prepared by E3 consulting folks for the Air Resources Board in October of last year. This is the baseline from which CARB is going to develop their scoping plan scenarios. We don't know what they're going to change. It may be exactly the same as this, or there may be some other things in addition. There are workshops rolling out over August, beginning next week on Tuesday with the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee meeting, where CARB will dive into how it crafts its scenarios. But these are the three that we know that is their starting point. CDR is carbon dioxide removal. And this, on the left-hand side, high CDR is a lot of carbon dioxide removal. In the middle, the balanced scenario, well, let me go to the end actually, all the way on the right-hand side is zero carbon energy scenario with minimal carbon dioxide removal. And the balanced is, as you would guess, balanced right in the middle, but all based on the degree of carbon dioxide removal. The final bit to bear in mind is that this is based on the Pathways modeling tool that the Air Resources Board uses. The Pathways tool does not include nature-based strategies, removing carbon through natural working lands. So most of this, when we talk about a high carbon dioxide removal, is really a high carbon capture and sequestration scenario. I show this slide just to show that how real this is. That's the way that CARB is currently looking at each of its scenarios is looking at whether the degree of carbon removal or carbon capture and sequestration that is involved. So it is a serious thing that the Air Resources Board is looking at. And the last thing I want to say, bringing it back to the governor's directive a few weeks ago, the governor issued a directive saying, let's accelerate our neutrality goal from 2045 to 2035. For us, that was, we can interpret that as a potential green light for carbon capture, given that for carbon removal, from using the nature-based strategies and even offsets, like looking at that list of methods that CARB has proposed to remove carbon from the atmosphere, a lot of those methods won't work in time. Like the forests, the other carbon sinks, they need 10, 15 years or so to actually do their job properly, to soak up enough carbon to really meet what they're expected to do. So that leaves the only option, if we are accelerating to 2035, to be direct air capture or carbon capture and sequestration methods. So not to end my presentation on a stock note, but again, we're looking at a very serious consideration of carbon capture in California. And again, this plan charts us all the way through 2045 and could lock us into these false solutions. So very important to get all of the information today, and very happy that I have all these great panelists to help shed some light on this false solution.
I think that I'm next.
I'm queuing up the amazing Carolyn Raffensperger.
So thank you so much for your presentation. I'm not sure if we have said what carbon capture and storage actually entails. So for the most part, carbon capture and storage, there are two kinds. One is capturing it from fossil fuel, the fossil fuel industry, say a refinery, and they put all the technology on that separates out the carbon dioxide from the other pollutants and takes that and moves that either through a pipeline and moves it through to store it deeply below the surface of the earth, the ocean, or to actually use it to frack more oil. So it is a great material for using in fracking. So it's going to be one of the issues that we talk about tonight. And I want to just raise what some of the issues are for the environmental community with carbon capture and storage. First of all, there's no actual reduction in fracking, drilling, and mining when we just put a CO2 capture device on top of a refinery or an ethanol plant. Transporting CO2 is hazardous, especially if it's situated near an oil pipeline. And right now that's what they're planning. They're planning on putting these CO2 pipelines in corridors with the oil, crude oil or tar sands pipelines. Transporting all of the supercritical CO2, and what I mean by that is that they pressurize the CO2 until it becomes a liquid. And if we transport just the CO2 from coal-fired power plants, we will move more liquids than the entire oil and gas industry moves today just for CO2 and just from coal-fired power plants. This is a major environmental justice issue because they want to create these hubs because that's the only way that it becomes economically viable. So we're going to put these hubs where we collect carbon dioxide, either on the refineries, that we gather it together and then we ship it off on these pipelines. And the problem with that is that we actually increase the air pollution because they're only capturing the CO2. So you know where these are going to be located. The pipelines are going to be in indigenous communities like the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the EJ communities in California will be the center for these hubs of gathering CO2. It's really the worst of capitalism. It's being promoted by ALEC, the American Legislative and Exchange Council, which is Koch brothers funding for really bad legislation. There are lots of ecological issues, the disruption of the ecosystems below the ground surface, and contamination of drinking water sources that depend on groundwater or aquifers. And then I will just note that the regulatory landscape is a mess, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because we don't have a lot of time tonight. So I just want to tell you about the newest proposal, and it's the largest proposed carbon capture and storage project in the world. And it's centered in the Midwest, but it has California connections. So what they want to do is they want to capture carbon dioxide from the ethanol plants in the Midwest. They want to build carbon dioxide pipelines and then use those rights of way that I told you about earlier for the Keystone XL pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline. Ship that CO2 to Illinois where they may bury it, but to North Dakota where they will use it to frack more oil that they can send back down through the Dakota Access Pipeline. They will then sell that ethanol in California as a low carbon fuel. Now, if you want to track the whole thing, Iowa is the most ecologically damaged state in the union. We're sending that filthy water down the Mississippi River and then creating the dead zone in the Gulf. We're going to increase corn production in Iowa so that we can sell ethanol in California as a low carbon fuel. We're all connected in this struggle. So the precautionary principle says when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. So I want to talk about how the precautionary principle actually applies in this situation. So there are three elements of that wonderful principle. There's scientific uncertainty. We don't have all the answers. Science hasn't given us all the answers, but there's a likelihood of harm. And so do we know enough to act? And we are asked or told to take precautionary action, even in the face of that uncertainty, to prevent that harm. So that doesn't tell you how you actually implement the precautionary principle. And here are a couple of ways that we've devised. And if you move through these step by step, and I'm going to do that tonight with carbon capture and storage, you set goals, you heed early warnings, you identify and choose the best alternative to harmful activities, you reverse the burden of proof. So right now, we're talking about how we actually probably have the burden to demonstrate that there are problems with carbon capture and storage, rather than industry showing that this is not actually, showing that it really is the best solution for climate. And then to engage in democratic decision-making, so that you engage all the stakeholders in decisions, especially in the face of scientific uncertainty. And I want to raise an issue about requiring the free, prior, and informed consent of communities who will be subject to some of these technologies. So I don't think you can see below the screen of people that the first item on that list I want to tackle is goals. I want to propose 2 goals. You can adopt your own, but for purposes of the conversation, I want to raise 2 goals that I think we share. The first is that we prevent runaway climate change and immediately draw down greenhouse gases. And the second is that we address environmental injustice, particularly in communities bearing the burdens of the fossil fuel infrastructure. Now, I've been to Los Angeles, traveled with Marta to look at the incredible burden that communities are bearing because of the oil and gas infrastructure in LA. So does carbon capture and storage help us meet either of those 2 goals? Does it help with climate change, or does it actually address environmental injustice? Short answer is no. And I'm going to tell you why. So the IPCC in 2018 did a special report, and they looked at several pathways for limiting global warming. And some of those pathways actually included carbon capture and storage. And what they said was the more commitment there is for carbon capture and storage, the longer it will take to get to carbon neutrality, and we will overshoot the 1.5 centigrade warming. It does not help us meet our climate goals. It is simply a delaying tactic. Building out carbon capture and storage infrastructure diverts investment money and takes government subsidies away from renewables. And by investing in carbon capture and storage, it commits us to greater sunk costs and a longer time frame for decommissioning those fossil fuel plants that are causing us so much trouble. It was actually invented to prolong the life of fossil fuels. So carbon capture and storage and environmental justice. It delays transition to renewable energy, and it props up the fossil fuel industry. It creates these hubs and pipeline corridors that can only make CCS work by creating them. And guess whose communities they're going to be located in. And here's a big point for California. It increases the cumulative impacts of and increases the burden on EJ communities. Carbon capture and storage requires vast increases in energy. So if you're going to put this on top of a refinery in LA, you have to increase the energy dramatically to that plant to pull off the carbon dioxide. And what you do by doing that is that you increase all those other pollutants. And so that increases all the other things besides carbon capture and CO2, and increases all of the other pollutants that we care about. So when I mentioned early warnings as one of the ways that we pay attention and implement the precautionary principle, what are the early warnings telling us about carbon capture and storage? For one thing, carbon capture requires more energy resulting in more pollutants other than CO2. Several of the carbon capture and storage facilities have already been shuttered because they didn't work, they weren't cost effective. The Bank of North Dakota, which is the only state bank in the country, declined to loan money to a carbon capture and storage project because it was too risky financially. So guess what the North Dakota legislators did? They went around the Bank of North Dakota and authorized that loan for that risky project. They were risking taxpayers' money for a project that people who really know finance said was too dangerous to invest in. And then one really important point, monitoring and certifying the amounts of CO2 stored is basically non-existent. It really relies on industry or third parties to self-report. And so there are two places where you actually account for this. One is with the IRS, and then with other reporting, the actual amounts of CO2, because you get the tax credit with the federal IRS. And if you've reported carbon capture and storage elsewhere, those numbers have to match up, and they don't. So that's a real weak point in this. So if we reverse the burden of proof, and the burden is not on us to show that we're going to continue to harm EJ communities, that we're not going to actually meet our climate goals using this, what should the fossil fuel industry be required to demonstrate? They should show that this is the safest, most cost-effective, and most just way to meet our goals, both for environmental justice and for climate. If we're going to use all this public money, and it's vast amounts of public money that we were going to use to build out CCS infrastructure, and what it means is that we will continue to enrich corporations like Exxon, rather than giving money to the communities that could actually solve these problems. And as a matter of environmental justice, they need to demonstrate that they will not add to the cumulative impacts of already stressed communities. Now, the last method for step in implementing the precautionary principle is democracy and consent. Consent of the governed is the most fundamental principle of a democracy. And the first thing that we know is that you should engage all the stakeholders in finding ways to meet goals and identify the best alternatives. And then you require consent before proceeding. So the best model around consent for community activity comes from the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. I didn't put in the whole name there, Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it requires free, prior, and informed consent of an Indigenous peoples before proceeding with activities that affect the community. What would free, prior, and informed consent look like for EJ communities in California? The bottom line, the IPCC pathways that include CCS are all worse for the environment and public health than any pathway that doesn't include it. The more carbon capture and storage in a pathway, and this is according to the IPCC, the worse it is. The carbon capture and storage provides no benefit under any scenario for public health and the environment. The only beneficiary is the fossil fuel industry. So the environmental justice punchline, it will increase the cumulative impacts of the fossil fuel industry. It delays climate action, and it takes public money from real community-based climate solutions. It makes inequality worse. It makes the rich richer and the poor. Thank you so much.
Hopefully my camera will work so I can see folks. And we do have some questions in the chat, and that we're going to hold those, and then at the end of the speakers, we'll take on the questions. So I want to welcome you. Sorry, I've lost my facilitator guide. I want to welcome Brent, who, you know, we actually just met as we were doing this networking, and he's going to talk a little bit about the carbon cycle and some current solutions, because yes, we will need to capture some carbon, but the key is how and who does it and in whose interests. So with that, Brent, please take it away.
Thank you. Can you all see my screen? There we go. Yep. Great. So let me dive right in. Thank you all for inviting me here. Definitely appreciate being. I will just jump into presentation so that we can run through. I wanted to give a little context. I was invited to speak about sort of some of the natural solutions to carbon sequestration, which I will definitely speak about. I do, instead of sort of a large-scale ecosystem thinker, as an urban ecologist, I do come with sort of a focus on urban ecosystems. So we'll talk about my sort of persuasion and interest around that. We are based in West Oakland, and about a decade ago started a project in partnership with someone you guys might know named Miss Margaret Gordon, West Oakland Environment Indicators. And what we were really looking at in our partnership called Urban Biofilter was ecological solutions to our urban environmental injustices. And so I'm gonna sort of first zoom out a little bit and just give a background on sort of carbon cycle from ecologist perspective, and then zoom back into what that means for those of us who are working in environmental justice. So for one, as an ecologist, I like to think about everything, whether we're in an urban or rural ecosystem, as a system, in that we have interdependent systems, atmospheric, hydrologic, biospheric, meaning life, and that both means humans and other ecosystems. And so we take an approach to the carbon cycle in this cyclical or systemic approach. And historically, basically what we had is plants and animals contributing most of the carbon cycle to our planet. And over time, what would obviously happen is a lot of that carbon would start to be sequestered in soil and peat bogs as fossil and limestone. And then we decided to start pulling that out of the earth and added this other component to the cycle. And so for us, a lot of what we like to focus on is that all of the carbon sequestration that we have to date, that we have relied on for hundreds of millions of years, has been in the form of biological sequestration. So plants turning into coal essentially over a really long period. And generally as an ecologist, I also defer to nature's evolution in creating solutions to carbon sequestration. So we'll normally sort of fall behind things that have been working for hundreds of millions of years. So in that context, now we look at this awkward system where we're pulling a lot of very stable carbon out of the ground, returning it through our energy and burning and land conversion. And so I think what I want to keep returning us to is, instead of people getting too focused on carbon capture solutions, if we just stopped using all this carbon as the primary solution, that would actually, and burning it, solve a lot of our problems. So, you know, our makeup of problems in the US is also a little different than the world. So when you look at the difference in the US, for example, unfortunately, we've already converted most of our land over to other uses, either urban or agriculture. So that's not one of our major inputs, but converting it back should be. And as we can see over time, basically oceans and land had always been the primary stock of carbon, and a small amount, even into the 60s, was in the atmosphere. And obviously that's changed. Now, as other people have been talking on the call, a lot of technocrats are looking at sort of infrastructure-based solutions to that. And I can argue that probably 99% of them do not have a balanced life cycle, in that, like, the amount of metal and pumps and everything to actually create the system generally doesn't pan out. I will be focusing therefore mostly on ecological carbon sequestration. I call it ecological because I find natural to be a little weird. I do put out a few concepts like this. This is someone's concept they were proposing for a city for algae to sequester carbon. I just want to point out that any of these types of strategies, when you see them, are completely insane and should not be supported. They generally require too much infrastructure and don't work. They're similar to a lot of the technocratic solutions, but there are sort of more balanced approaches people are taking to look at where and how we should store carbon. This was a study done by the Nature Conservancy in 2018. And what we're really looking at is the potential for restoration in the US in particular here, and where different carbon sequestration can go. Obviously, the lion's share goes into sort of reforestation and forest management. Obviously, for a lot of people that may be in the conversation know, but others don't know, the way that we store carbon with forests is both basically in the soil and in the biomass, but then we also lose it when it either burns or is used for other reasons. One of the things too, as far as us in California, when we look at sort of existing forest lands and potential forest lands for this type of restoration, most of it's not in California. And most of the forest land in California is actually what they call kind of low priority for carbon storage. And that's unfortunately partly because of the fire regime here, where it's not actually a very stable carbon storage. The other big component that's driving it is sort of the global hydrology cycle. So forests consume most of the global water that is not seawater. And so as we get drier, our ecosystem shifts away from forests to more grasslands. So a lot of the studies being done by Davis, I can point people to that, and others are showing, depending on different climate change scenarios, sort of sequestering carbon in California's grasslands is far more important than forests. People normally think about trees. And a lot of what people don't realize is that a lot of the carbon is actually stored below the soil in grasslands as opposed to forests. So in these contexts, at a certain point, something like 8,000% of the organic material is stored not as the plant, either above or below ground, but in more stable biomass. And when we look at all the ecosystems across the world, you know, below ground biomass is where most of the carbon is stored, especially in like boreal forests that gave us peat bogs and coal. So in California, when we look at a lot of the ecosystems and where we should be thinking, we should be mostly looking at like the light green, which is natural grasslands, and the brown, which is now agricultural land that we've converted to that from mostly grasslands and peat. So I think the big challenge we're going to be facing is we need to be, unfortunately, pushing against a lot of increased agriculture in California to actually push back and refuse to convert that to a number of different alternative uses and kind of tell people to grow their food somewhere else, unfortunately, I think, is some of the challenge that I think will be very political. My computer just froze too, so maybe I'll stop there. I had a few more slides, but are you guys frozen over there too?
I can hear you.
I'm sorry, I don't know why my slides stopped advancing. Let me jump down. So yeah, just quickly, I can finish here. A bunch of what we've looked at is natural grasslands and alternatives to annual crops like perennial crops, other conversions to biomass and forests. And another place that I would say is extremely important in addition to the agricultural land is really focusing on the aquatic habitat as well. One of the problems is globally, aquatic ecosystems are not seen as one of the major potential sinks for carbon. But I think that this is one of my core issues around using sort of just a standard carbon calculation approach, because when we look at the standpoint of California, we're in an extremely unique ecosystem. There's only sort of a handful of really impressive kelp and seaweed forests around the world. And this is where I think we need to have very regional solutions to our natural approaches to say that even though it's maybe not capturing a huge amount of carbon, it's from a biodiversity standpoint, one of the most important ecosystems, and from a coastal resiliency standpoint. And so just to kind of close it out, a lot of my challenge or beef with folks at Carb or otherwise doing carbon calculating is that we do a very direct calculation where we're saying, okay, what's the cost of the greenhouse gas over its sort of offset efficiency? And that's how much money we decide to spend somewhere. And we're seeing problems around this throughout the state and the country where we're not targeting the money where we need to. And so these don't really sell to me. I think what we've fallen into is this sort of technocratic pitfall where we have the same externalities, and what we take is someone at Berkeley called a carbon fundamentalism, as opposed to sort of a co-benefit approach. And so what we're trying to do is sort of convert and calculate those alternatives so that we can convince CARB and others, love your guys' support, to actually calculate historic externalities and have that drive where we put funding. So instead of it being the greenhouse gas and, you know, having a little bit of a catering to send some of it to EJ communities, I think we need to flip the calculation and really focus our funding not on greenhouse gases, but on health-related air pollutants. And I think this is a major issue. When we look at where all of our factories are and most of our power distribution, those all fall under EJ communities. And those should be the first focus of where we do funding, and it shouldn't be driven by greenhouse gas calculations. So there was a really interesting study done recently where everywhere that we closed down power plants, we had dramatic increases in health impacts being reduced, for example, like birth weights changing, really interesting studies. So a lot of what we've been doing in Oakland is sort of looking at and using one of the things Martha worked into the CARB process, which is sort of an adaptive management plan for how they deal with carbon. And our big driver is for communities like ourselves to work together and say, not just where is the carbon coming from, but what is causing the health and cancer risks in our community. And this was a big thing we had to do to work with the port and others here in Oakland, was to say, everyone's worried about greenhouse gases and they're mostly coming from the ships, but the pollution coming from the trucks is what's causing 70% of our health impacts and cancer. So I think that's the big driver for us. And what we're doing is working on sort of urban ecosystem strategies that can buffer near road pollution and other things from inhabitants, but we need to work with CARB and CNRA and all these people to basically shift how we do the calculation so funding goes to this rather than just greenhouse gases. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. And again, we're monitoring the chat. We're going to keep the questions for the Q&A period. And our next speaker is Anthony Rogers-Wright, who's with the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. Anthony, it's wonderful to see you. We've had the opportunity to work and struggle and caper in Los Angeles around creating the Climate Mobilization Office. And we'll share your larger bio in the chat. But Faisal, it's wonderful to see you. Why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much, Marta. It's always great to see you. And I'm sorry if I'm a little frazzled. There was a bit of a kerfuffle with my schedule, and I like just rushed home from the Puget Sound to get to this. So I'm like speaking to you all while also situating myself and making sure that like I'm actually with you. But what I'm going to present as soon as I find my presentation is you know, I think continuing the discussion, I'm sure from what I've missed of really we're in a moment of precarity right now where instead of climate denialism, what the greenwashers and the fossil fuel industry, unfortunately, along with allies like certain facets of organized national labor, are instead really just trying to co-opt the entire narrative and the narrative of climate solutions specifically. And carbon capture and sequestration is a perfect example of that. So I think I have my slideshow ready, and I just need to share my screen, which I can do. All right. And I'm hoping everybody can see that. Can you confirm, Martha? Can y'all see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Good to go. So, you know, I mean, I'm being a little facetious and a little irreverent and tongue-in-cheek, but really carbon capture and sequestration, direct air capture technology really does represent, as far as we're concerned at New York Lawyers for Public Interest, as well as in partnership with the New York Renews Coalition, who we're part of, green unicorn, a false solution, and the newest wave of climate fiction. And we'll get into why that is. And I'm sorry if there's any repetitive information, but here we go nonetheless. First, I just think it's important to present to you just a chronology, big oil's crude chronology, as I call it. Right, this is the industry that is mainly behind this technology, and we all know who they are, but you know it really it makes it very lucid right here. Since the 1970s, we now know through excellent and Pulitzer Prize winning reporting of the LA Times and Inside Climate News that the hashtag ExxonNew came about from their reporting, which revealed to us that since the 1970s, these big oil cartels have known the science, have known that their products were having deleterious impacts on the atmosphere. That back then was called global warming. Since then, we've called it climate change. Lots of iterations, but they've known since then. In the 1980s, there's a global expansion to double down. We wanted more of these fossil fuel deposits, and we saw this through the so-called the pinnacle of the Cold War, where we are really spreading ourselves to try to control oil deposits in as far south as Venezuela, all throughout the African continent, and of course laying the groundwork to do so in the Middle East. And then in the 1990s, while we actually did really exacerbate the military theater in the Middle East, big oil started commencing on an intentional and concentrated climate denial propaganda initiative, very, very similar to what we saw with big tobacco. As a matter of fact, in the 1990s was when we saw the transition from calling what we're experiencing now, global warming, to climate change, when a right-wing pundit named Frank Luntz held a focus group and asked people which sounded more dire, and people said global warming. So he said, what about climate change? And be like, oh yeah, that sounds a little more innocuous. We're literally using the language of the right now, and I just want to state that that's how powerful these forces are. In the 2000s, big oil launched a legislative hegemony. We saw this specifically with the Energy Act of 2005, which of course includes what's known as the Halliburton loophole as part of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is why we don't actually know the exact chemicals that are included in fracking fluid that's injected underground and impacting our aquifers, because the Halliburton loophole, which was the brainchild of Dick Cheney, Vice President Dick Cheney, are considered trade secrets, and so and this is also when we see the Enrons. I mean, just big money from big oil going into the legislative process. And where we find ourselves now, 2010 to the present, as I said earlier, is the greenwashing epoch, from denial to the seizure of the narrative and the rise of false solutions. And we really saw this. I mean, for all of the accolades and the heralding that we like to do of COP21 in Paris, this was that Paris Global Agreement was agreed to by Exxon and supported by BP, because we started seeing ideas of false solutions like Article 6, so-called carbon offsets, as well. If you went to any of these COPs, you would see all of these booths really pushing this carbon capture technology. So really, this is all concerted to the moment we're in today. So what we mean by false solutions, aka green unicorns, it all centers around the nucleus of this idea, this feckless, myopic idea of net zero emissions. And again, it's in the lexicon. Democrats are using the language, Republicans are using the language, and thank goodness now, as I'll show you in a moment, we do have some scientists that have totally refuted that. What I like to say about net zero emissions and sort of this idea of carbon offsets, which is really what it's trying to say, is that it would be the equivalent of me having to go on a diet, but for my own personal physical health. But one day I splurged on a bunch of food and binge on a bunch of food that I shouldn't have eaten. So I call like my sister Marta and I say, hey Marta, can you not eat anything today to offset all the food that I've eaten? You obviously can see from that analogy that's ridiculous, and it wouldn't actually work. But it all centers around net zero. And included in this set of false solutions to get us to net zero, carbon capture, sequestration, also carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We're going to dig into that. I call it the Roy G. Biv hydrogen, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, yellow hydrogen, which is still created from the combustion of fossil fuels. Geoengineering, this idea, for instance, of solar radiation, or we'll shoot sulfur particles into the air to mimic volcanic eruptions to cool the planet. Also seen in that movie, The Matrix, if you didn't see that, when they scorched the skies to beat the machines. It didn't work there. And then new nuclear is also, it's zero emissions, and we have better technology now, but we still haven't figured out what to do with all the waste of so-called new nuclear, and we all know where that waste will end up. Not to mention, these are expensive plants, and they can't even come online for the next 15 or 20 years, when we're being told by science we have 8 years to really get this climate crisis under control. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, this is from a recent report by scientists and professors Dyke, Watson, and Noor, just recently, 2 months ago. They basically said the idea of net zero has licensed reckless, cavalier, burn now, pay later approach, and it's hastened the destruction of the natural world by increasing deforestation and greatly increasing the future devastation or the risk of further devastation in the future. Not to mention the infringement on free, prior, and informed consent and primordial, indigenous, and tribal sovereignty the world over. That will just recolonize our land so we can plant trees to continue doing what we're doing. So CCS, it's all the same family, right? It all comes from this family of net zero. So moving on. Let's go. So, there are 3 things that we can do with this so-called captured carbon dioxide, right? We inject it underground for storage, and I'm sure some people have spoken about already. We can sell it as chemical feedstock, right? So we're actually putting it back into a toxic loop, or we can sell it for oil extraction. And that brings us to this idea of so-called enhanced oil recovery, which is essentially another form of fracking. Right now, of the plants that are actually operational, which aren't too many in the United States, and I don't even think there are any in the United States at this point, but the majority of that captured CO2 was used for enhanced oil recovery. So it's not even net zero as much as it is a false solution of the illusion of, we're not reusing this oil, but they're reusing the CO2 to get more oil. The bottom line is, the scientists told us, as many I'm sure you are aware of, that we have to keep 80% of remaining fossil fuel deposits in the ground to have a chance of averting the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. But that's trillions of dollars, and the oil and gas industry have basically stuck their collective middle finger up at us and said, we're not giving up, trillions and trillions of dollars, and we probably wouldn't do it if we were in their situation. So, but this is really what we're talking about with CCS. These are the 3 choices of what we can do with it. All of them come with precarious consequences. Underground storage, we've seen in Black communities like Yazoo County, Mississippi, blowouts, which have led to loss of flora and fauna, hospitalizations, which is and this is where all of these facilities are going to be located: Black, brown, indigenous, and poor white communities, where these smokestacks and power plants are. So we're going to go essentially from rendering them into energy sacrifice zones to rendering them into energy guinea pigs, because this is unproven technology again, and we'll keep going. And also, I do want to get into why it's dire right now, and I'll get to that in a moment. So, current carbon projects in the U.S. This data is from 2014, so this may not be the case anymore. I just want to say that I do need to look this up and make sure that this is accurate, but at the time, there were 12 commercial carbon capture plants in the United States. None were actually at a power plant, and they are all smokestack capture, which means they're associated with natural gas extraction and processing. That's 5 of the 12. Fertilizer production, as I just spoke about, that's 3 of the 12. Hydrogen production and ethanol production. So, what you're basically seeing is that the CCS plants that were or still are in operation is to keep the flow of oil and gas going under the guise of capturing carbon. None are actually direct air capture plants. So that's what I meant by unproven. We're the amount of money that we've been throwing at it so far, billions of dollars, probably close to $100 billion in the last 6 months alone, for something that hasn't even been proven yet. And here's the bottom line: none of the existing CCS plants actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, because smokestack capture doesn't remove CO2 that's already in the air. Really important. Which brings us to enhanced oil recovery. As I said earlier, this is really just another form of fracking. We're injecting it underground. We're shaking up shale. We're trying to get more oil to come up. We produce wells. These wells are located in Black, Brown, Indigenous, frontline environmental justice communities, and essentially continuing the cycle. And again, the vast majority of these carbon capture plants, the vast majority of the carbon dioxide that is captured is used for enhanced oil recovery. And again, bottom line, we're pumping carbon dioxide underground to force more oil out of wells, and it's not even effective. Here we go. U.S. subsidies can actually increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere if we continue to subsidize this technology. Carbon capture with EOR. This comes from an amazing woman, June Sakura, who is a former expert on this. She's probably on this call for all I know. And if you are, June, I hope I'm doing you right. But for CCS with EOR, it emits 1.4 to 1.7 tons of carbon dioxide for each ton removed. So it's not even net zero, right? We're actually going above what we're capturing, so called. And for direct air capture fossil fuel powered plants, they emit 1.5 to 3.4 tons of carbon dioxide for each ton removed. And this does not even include transport, injection, and all of the other energy inputs. More evidence that this is just crap. The effectiveness and scale of this it's an issue, of effectiveness and scale. Currently, when this data was released, the United States released around 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. That actually is up to 6.5, and I just saw that about 2 days ago. The largest direct air capture plant known captures less than 1/10, well less than 1/10 of a gigaton a year of carbon dioxide equivalents. The planned direct air capture plant, through all these subsidies that our government has been giving, is supposed to capture a 1,000th of a gigaton per year of CO2 equivalents. And if the aggregate of all CCS plants that were or are still in operation captures less than 1/100th of a gigaton per year. So profligate, energy intensive, carbon intensive for nothing. This again is to continue the cycle of the big oil hegemony, and under the guise they've unfortunately ensorcelled even labor, will create more jobs because they know that it also requires more pipelines. So I think that I'm going to stop there, Marta, so we can open it up for questions. But overall, carbon capture tech is not a benefit for environmental justice communities. Really quickly, I want to say it's not a benefit for a reason. As many of you have heard, the Biden administration dangled something in front of EJ communities called the Justice 40 Initiative, where 40% of the benefits were supposed to go to environmental justice communities. And Gina McCarthy, Secretary Granholm from Department of Energy are trying to characterize direct air capture and CCS as a benefit to environmental justice communities in lieu of 40% of investments, where we would prefer to have the money and we will determine what's a benefit for our communities, which is why this also has implications for the Hyphae principles for democratic organizing, as well as the principles of environmental justice. So I'll stop there, but we are in a perilous situation right now. The bipartisan package that was just agreed to by Democrats and Republicans includes close to $70 billion for nuclear and carbon capture sequestration. The Energy Act of 2020, which was one of Donald Trump's last omnibus packages to keep the government open, allocated like $300 billion to carbon capture and other geoengineering schemes. And then the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package that's going to be coming, you can bet, is also going to include lots and lots of appropriated money for this. So it's time for a concerted effort, and we really need to have stern, cogent, and direct communications with labor right now, and let them know that they are using the same argument as the fossil fuel cartels, and putting environmental justice, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor white communities at risk for theoretical jobs of a theoretical technology that would lead to non-theoretical, non-fiction impacts on EJ communities. I'll stop there. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much. Well, I want to open up the floor to questions, because I don't want to editorialize. So But I do think, this, well, I'm going to stop talking. And do we have some folks in the queue for questions, Colin? Oh, there's the Q&A.
Yes,
So, go for it, Colin.
Great. Yes, thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists. I learned so much and feel both more informed and also quite alarmed and activated to push back on this false solution. So there is a question from Richard Brawlins, who is agreeing with concerns about how carbon capture and removal is deployed. And he is acknowledging that with climate tipping points already active, he's asking, how do we reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide to less than 350 parts per million without carbon capture and storage? That sounds like kind of a question about what the real solutions are if we're not going to go with CCS.
Can I just answer that in part? And that is that carbon capture and storage as it's currently being used is it's used to advance the fossil fuel industry. So it's capturing carbon dioxide from fossil fuel refineries and other things. To do that requires a lot more energy to actually power the carbon dioxide capture. And then to pressurize it and move it through pipelines or inject it underground. And that's part of why it increases the carbon dioxide. There is another technology which is usually used as direct air capture, and that is acting like a vacuum cleaner in the atmosphere itself, pulling carbon dioxide out. That might be useful, but that technology is really undeveloped. But this other technology that we've mostly been talking about tonight, which is capping some kind of fossil fuel plant and capturing the oil from that, and that, or the carbon dioxide from that, and then allowing that fossil fuel company to declare that it's carbon neutral. And so that is not an answer. It's not the way that we draw this down is that we stop using fossil fuels. We stop now. Using carbon capture is just extending their life cycle. We got to stop.
And I just want to add to that quickly as well. In California, we've had a law since 2016 that says we have to prioritize decreasing pollution from large industrial sources. So we have to do all of that first before we even start looking at these other indirect solutions or false solutions like carbon capture as well. And meanwhile, we're making such good progress on electrification efforts and renewables in general, but there are so many barriers to low-income folks or EJ communities getting to live in all-electric homes or drive electric vehicles. And so how do we figure out the barriers to those things first? So we have a lot of the solutions in front of us. It's just we're distracted by these unfortunate false solutions as well.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is that there are natural processes that already do this. I put something in the chat called the 4 per 1,000 initiative, and I know we're in a danger zone even with regenerative agriculture and agroecological practices, where they're trying to greenwash that now, right? Like corporations are trying to use that terminology. The majority of our food is created by small family farmers worldwide. That's just a fact. And we have to emulate what our sisters, brothers, and friends to the south are doing, La Via Campesina and so many others, and increase that scale. But we have to do it in a way that is not a false solution, as Brother Roger was just saying. So when you see tantalizing pieces of legislation like the Growing Climate Solutions Act, like, oh, we're going to pay farmers to sequester carbon and carbon dioxide equivalents to offset what big corporations are doing, that's not what the 4 per 1,000 initiative is doing. It's just saying, change the way we do agriculture, writ large. And then, as Sister Caroline said, of course, I mean, yes, we have to stop using fossil fuels like immediately. We have the battery technology, to end the ridiculous argument about what happens on cloudy days. I am from Seattle. We have battery storage. We can figure it out. And of course, even dumber arguments that wind turbines cause cancer. I just think that we have to fight back against, we have to control the narrative. We've been beaten in that game for far too long. And as I like to say, narrative represents our seeds. Everything grows out of that. If we don't have control over that, what grows out is going to be tainted. So I agree with Roger and Caroline. We got to take it back and let people know, including our friends in labor, that this is not the way to go.
Anyone else out there have a feedback? I've got one or two elements to add, but
You want to go? I am in the car, and so it's hard to read the Q&A without getting a little dizzy. So, yeah. Colin, if you could back me up.
No worries.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Carolyn, Roger, and Anthony, for what you've shared as well just now. Brent, did you want to jump in as well and respond to that question about how we reduce atmospheric CO2 to safe levels without the false solutions?
Yeah, I think I'll first tackle Richard's question about sort of the delay and the time that it takes for more nature-based solutions. And the one perspective I would put in there as an ecologist, and I really liked sort of the framing and how Anthony was talking about language and the narratives that we've applied to these issues. I think as an ecologist, one of our core problems is everyone wants to oversimplify this problem and only think about it in the context of carbon, whereas carbon is one component in many cycles that are functioning on Earth. And I think when we start to talk about words like safe and stable climate, it's sort of like safe and stable for what, which is like the status quo of humanity or biodiversity, right? And so I have much less of an urgency issue, like we need to achieve this by a certain day, because I think that's a very human and techno-centric approach. I think we need to say like the ecosystem's going to be here, maybe humans won't thrive. And like the core goal is how do we maintain biodiversity right now so that we don't take out everyone else with ourselves. And so I think that's just a whole flip on the narrative rather than this like, oh my God, we have to hit 350 by this year. I mean, if that helps other people that wouldn't already be incentivized, that's great. But I think that's a core problem. And then, so I would say, yeah, all of the ideas that we need short return solutions is not accurate. I mean, there's another solid billion years on the planet before it burns up. A lot of species will have an opportunity here. My specific take on carbon capture as sort of a second question is that I am not opposed to carbon capture. I think though that it should primarily and only be done at power plants in cities next to fence line communities first to actually reduce health impacts on people. So I do support that as a component to sort of improving our environmental health.
Brent, I think you're actually got that a little bit backwards. It actually increases the pollution because it requires so much more energy and it only captures the CO2. So it does not catch the rest of the pollutants. And so it increases the other pollutants, only captures CO2, and that's a problem.
Oh, no, I agree 100%. I mean, that's where on this slide I started with is stop talking about just greenhouse gases. And if we're talking about pollution capture in cities, let's look at health impact pollutants and not just greenhouse gases. So I agree, but it's the type of technology that was applied, not that could be.
Yeah, well, carbon capture and storage actually increases the other pollutants. So it's a non-starter from an environmental justice perspective in an environmental justice community.
So I have if there isn't another question, I sort of have a question for the speakers, but also, you know, a lot of our advocacy folks are on the phone, you know, that there seems to be several things. One is figuring out how to, at a policy level, address what's happening at the California Air Resources Board. They are all in around carbon capture. And that's one part, like where do we have that battle? And then the second part is around the story and the narrative, right? Because this sense of urgency, I hear it backing up a lot of false solutions, right? From, decarbonizing buildings, right? And I'm like, well, the solutions that you've developed don't have equity. And then, yeah, that's really bad. But you know what? It's really urgent. So your justice has to wait, because I feel this low-lying fruit, top of the market strategy satisfies my sense of urgency. And so there's this need to shift the story. If Anthony or others can speak to that part of our challenge.
Yeah, I'm happy to, Sister Martha. And I wouldn't be doing a right by you on a panel if I didn't quote Adrienne Marie Brown, as you know. So I'm going to do my obligatory Adrienne Marie Brown quote for you. And she would remind us, right, we are in a sense of urgency, but it was a sense of urgency that got us here in the first place, which is how we start making arguments like you just stated that are being made. And I think it's important what Carolyn just said. Environmental justice communities don't want this stuff in their communities. So we have to adhere to the principles of environmental justice and self-determination. The White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, in their interim report, stated this is not a benefit. EJ communities don't want it there. So if you want to put it in Chappaqua and Beverly Hills, fine, if that's what they want. But we don't want it, and we don't want the network of pipelines also that would be created with it. So but to your point of where does that leave us if CARB is behind this? California is all about planning, right? That's where the real power is at the local level. There's an amazing guy named, he's okay. His name is Robert Fulton, though. He wrote a good book called A Guide to California Planning, which is it stands the test of time. I think this is going to be a local fight, Martha. I think that now is the time to be talking to public service commissioners and the county commissioners and zone this crap out. Just don't let it in, and and really make sure that the CEQA process is airtight. Unfortunately, CEQA does not allow, California Environmental Quality Act, does not allow for a socioeconomic analysis, which is ludicrous to me in this day and age in California. So any way that can be implemented, but I think this is going to be a local fight now, county by county, city by city, and that's where Marta and anyone else who does environmental justice organizing, that we're the best at that, right? We're the local translocal folks, so that's good news for us. But I think that's where the fight is. Please say climate crisis instead of climate change. Yes, climate crisis. Yes, and absolutely, I agree with you. One thing, while I have the mic, I do. There was someone in the chat. I think it was Anne who talked about this issue of carbon pricing. Please ask your senators and Russian Citizens Climate Lobby. And I have great respect for Citizens Climate Lobby, but I think they get the issue a little bit wrong on emissions pricing. One, just giving people a rebate is not the answer. Two, emissions pricing is not an emissions reduction tool in New York State, where we passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to be funded by an emissions pricing. We do not see it as an emissions reduction tool. It is a revenue generation tool to fund the just transition by people who are directly responsible for the climate crisis. The CCL approach, in my opinion, does not reinvest enough money into the commons, and that's where that money has to go back to, especially when we see I'm gonna say straight out and say it. A lot of white people don't deserve a rebate from a carbon tax, because Black and brown people are disproportionately breathing in the pollution that is generated by white people. So we have to tweak that a bit, that approach. So I'll end that. But in terms of CARB, just real quick again, Marta, local fight. Public service commissions, county commissioners, home rule. Let's zone the crap out. Let's just zone it out and hold people we have access to accountable. We have access to county commissioners. We have access to public service commissioners, and we should let them know now we don't want it.
I just wanted to follow on to that amazing point, Anthony, that as well that when we are talking about the California Environmental Quality Act, the scoping plan has to go through that process as well. So all of the impacts we've discussed today it better darn well appear in the CARB scoping plan, and so that the CARB board of directors can then be like, okay, do I really want to authorize this? So going back to how folks can get involved, we have upcoming workshops. I'll let Martha and others talk about those, but as much noise about this as possible to make sure it's in the plan so that the board of directors can be like, oh, is this what I'm really voting for? Or is this what I'm really approving for the next 23 years or so? And I think that'll send a loud message as well to even the feds, but I definitely agree that this is going to be a big local fight, and echo everything Anthony said.
And I want to speak to Kate's question about labor. I think the building trades and even the steel workers, who are often our friends, are lost to us on this. And that where we really need to build alliance and education are the teachers union, the service unions, the nurses unions. Their residents live in the front lines, right? They will live in these areas that if you're putting carbon capture of CO2 near refineries, that's a direct impact on the people that they serve and their rank and file. So I think it's about creating an alternative voice for an alternative economy that's based on care. And there we do the movement building that we've all been doing, right? That we want, that fights for the commons, that fights for universal health care. That's where we build the movement to actually address the climate crisis with justice versus emergency and panic and, grabbing photos and leaving other things in the fire, right? We don't often think right when we're acting on emergency mode. So I can't see if there's other questions. Yeah. Comments? Okay, now we'll take comments. Just teasing all of you.
I would like to add, while we're waiting for those comments and questions, that this does raise what's the role of government. And we've had 50 years of thinking that government's responsibility is to grow the economy, and certainly carbon capture and storage helps the fossil fuel industry stay in business. But the real role of government is well-being. It's to take care of the commonwealth and public health for present and future generations. And I think we just keep hammering that too. They're showing their ambivalence. Oh, I can't get in the way of the economy, and hand-wringing. Yeah, they can get in the way of money that is lining the pockets of the polluters, taking it away from the community, and inflicting these pollutants on us and on communities that have already been unfairly burdened. So their job is not to make Exxon rich. Their job is to protect public health and the environment.
Annie Waterman, I'm sitting here all alone raising my fist. Yay, Annie.
I see, Marta, from Kate Kennedy, there's a question, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name. How do we convince unions and organized labor to oppose carbon capture in order to benefit a lot of their members? Yeah, I can wait to answer that if anyone else has some ideas.
I think the trades and that's why I said the care-based economy unions, the teachers union, the nurses union, this, service workers, I don't, can we convince them that there are more jobs in the restoration? There are more jobs, right? If we have a restorative approach, an ecosystems approach, this, ecological approach, how do we figure out what those jobs look like? And we do need to do more talking directly with them versus at each other. And I think it's also about changing the story. That story's been written by the mainstream enviros, and it is not benefiting labor really long-term or us. So.
Yeah, Marta, I mean, I everything you said, I mean, I don't like being at odds with labor. That's terrible. I mean, and there are things on our side that we have to do. We know that some of our leftism has gotten a little elitist, right? Like, I love the Ivy League schools and whatnot, and forget about our amazing state schools that have produced, great people like Frances Fox Piven and Jane McCaveley. And that's to our detriment, because we have to be honest. that it's backwards. The unionized jobs are being produced by the fossil fuel industry, and the non-unionized jobs are being produced by the renewable energy sector. What? And so we don't really have a leg to stand on. What I like to say a lot is that labor's just transition is our carbon capture and sequestration. You know, they look at us when we say just transition like you're out of your mind. Just like you know, and the thing, the unfortunate thing is that we have not demonstrated how just transition can actually work yet. We have some opportunities in New Mexico with Senate Bill 489, where they put $40 million aside for workers who will be impacted by the shuttering of the coal-fired power plants there. That has to work. Also, we have legislation on the table, the Reclaim Act. You know, it's like Sarah Nelson, who we hope takes over for Richard Trumka, because that would make our lives so much easier, because she believes in just transition. But what she says is, keep the promises today that you've made today. Like you've said you're going to help these miners and these coal, and where is it? Like, you know, where is that? So, you know, demonstrate to us, because this is not just jobs. We're talking about people's livelihoods. And Carolyn is right. We're talking about ending the industry that you depend on money for right now, right? And asking you right now to take a $40,000 pay cut to go from pipe fitting to installing solar panels. And I joke around all the time, but it's real. If we ask the average organizer in a grassroots organization to take a $40,000 pay cut, their salary would be negative $20,000. And so I think on our side, going back to what you said earlier, Marta, about narrative, and we've just got to prove that this works, because right now the renewable energy jobs are not as skilled, and they're not paying as much, and you know, it's disingenuous to ask anyone to take a pay cut in this economy right now. And then, of course, we also have to like show people what a feminist economy looks like, what a care economy looks like, and then I think that we'll have a foundation. But it's not going to be easy work to the person who asked that question. Some of the state labor organizations are with us, New Mexico, even in Maine, where they passed a Green New Deal with a just transition component. But even in New York, you know, I mean, you know, they're rightfully scared. And I think we, as Marta said, we got to see the humanity of these workers and not just them as numbers and statistics.
I just want to address the pipeline issue, because we know that government is not doing the kind of investment in clean water and drinking water infrastructure, sewage infrastructure. And so it's the master limited partnerships, these big energy companies like Energy Transfer Partners putting in Dakota Access, that has vast billions of dollars to invest in an oil pipeline. But government has been starved through that same idea, you know, austerity, privatization, deregulation that came out of the Powell memo and other things. And what we've got to do is make the case that the basic infrastructure we need for public health and the environment, for well-being, is good paying jobs. Those pipes for laying clean water are should be just as good as a tar sands or a crude oil pipeline.
Well, we're at time, and we want to do next steps. So we want you to register for the Carb Workshop on August 2nd. You can follow the link. It's CSS Pushback. You can follow that link. And so we've shared a lot of material here. There's other fact sheets that if you want to sort of dig into the technical parts of it, because expect a highly technical presentation that will tell us, extol the virtues of carbon capture. Expect that labor will be showing up. Labor's been like hammering at the EJ community. So we really need you there to support the Environmental Justice Committee and all of us who are trying to fight for real solutions. There'll be, after each of the sets of presentations, and we still don't have those, it probably won't be out till Monday, maybe tomorrow afternoon. So at 10:45 to 11:30, there'll be public comment. 12:45 to 1:30, 2:30 to 3:15 will also be public comment. And so we encourage you to sign up, attend, share the webinar with your network, and you have all of our contact information if you want other. We've got some great fact sheets and other information. We will be developing other ways to engage with the board members, probably a letter from physicians and communities, and nurses and others about why we need real solutions that focus on health. And with that, I just want to thank everybody. You have 2 minutes to spare. And again, it is wonderful to be working with Caroline and Anthony together on this. It's just wonderful. And again, thank you to Colin and Rahel. And I think Paula is in the background doing tech, because this was Facebook, it was on Facebook Live. So I want to appreciate all of the PSR-LA and San Francisco folks I see. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you all so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Brent.
Thanks, guys. Great to meet y'all.